If I told you, if I told you just half of everything I've always wanted to.
Welcome back, Camily, to another Tea Time with Cam. Today I have a mixture of two teas, mango tango and lemon drop mate. It's still brewing up in here. Today's topic is really important to me. We're going to talk about the 5 stages of grief. Grief is something that mostly everyone will experience at some point in their life, but even though it's such a universal experience, I find that it's kind of hard to talk about. But I think it's because it makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Before I experienced grief myself, it was something that I was quite terrified of. I remember my grandpa getting diagnosed with cancer when I was 16, and at that point I had never experienced losing someone. And Landon had already lost several grandparents at that point, and I was telling him, like, Landon, I don't think I can do this. If my grandpa dies, I don't know what I'd do with myself. And he told me that it would be okay and he would be there for me. My grandpa ended up passing away just months after Landon did, but at that point I was well experienced with grief after losing him. And I think back to 16-year-old Cameron and how unfamiliar the feeling of grief was to her. And at this point it is a very familiar feeling. I feel it every day. Grief is much more complicated than the 5 stages we're going to talk about today. It's so complex, there's so much to it, which is why a lot of professionals kind of steer away from using the model of the 5 stages of grief. But I do think it's helpful, at least while you're in those phases, to be able to identify them. But understand that there's a lot more to it. Understand that these stages aren't chronological. It's not like you go from one phase to another in a specific order. You actually cycle through these phases very fast in a really random order. What changes as time goes by is the amount of time that you stay in those stages. So in those first few months, a lot of people find that they can go through multiple stages of grief in just an hour. Your feelings are just moving so fast and they're so intense. But as time goes on, you learn to feel these feelings in a more productive way and give yourself the space and the time to feel each of these feelings and understand them and slowly start to carry them a little lighter. I like to think of grief as a weight, as a heavy weight on your shoulders. And when that weight first gets placed on you, it is really hard to carry. And it's not that the weight ever gets any lighter, it's just that you get stronger. And you find ways to shift it around to make it easier to carry. I also like to think of it as the ocean, because it really does come in waves, and sometimes they're small waves, and sometimes they're really big waves. And it's very unpredictable. And it's weird because in between those big waves crashing down, there's a stillness. And in those gaps is where you live your life, where you try and rebuild. And there's almost a numbness to that. And when you're grieving, a lot of the time, the only part that you show to people is those gaps, those moments in between those waves hitting you. And so if you know someone who's grieving and they seem really okay, they seem really strong, like they're handling it so well and you don't really understand it, it's because in that moment they're not being drowned by those waves. But trust me, those waves hit. So the first stage of grief that we're going to talk about is denial, and that's often the first phase. This also ties in with shock. When you're in shock, you are not yourself. People can act really strange, can say and do things that are not them, things that make no sense, have no logic behind them. Their brain is not working as it should. It is a total shock to the system. And when that denial comes in, that is your brain trying to protect itself. It knows that you can only handle so much at once, and those big, heavy feelings can only be put on you for so long without it absolutely breaking you. So to protect itself, your brain's gonna deny it. Deep down, you know the truth. You know the reality of the situation. You know what has happened. But it feels like you're in a dream. It feels like this isn't real, there's no way this is real. And this is one of the easier stages of grief to be in because it is a self-protectant space. Between those waves of heavy grief, I stayed in denial for a lot of that time. My brain wouldn't allow it to feel real because it knew I had things to do. I had kids to take care of. I couldn't allow myself to believe it, so I was just in denial. The next stage we're going to talk about is bargaining. And for me, this one really feels like racing thoughts one after another. It usually leads to an anxiety attack when I'm kind of hit with this wave. And for me, this looked like going into every single memory I had with him, recounting every little occasion where maybe I could have done something differently that would have changed the outcome. If I had only done this, or if I had only checked on him sooner, just spending hours overthinking every little thing I ever said to him, and then just screaming into the void like, please give me another chance. This can't be it. This can't be the way that everything unfolded. Just let me go back to this one moment and change this one thing, and maybe he'd still be here. And that's a really hard stage to sit in, especially for too long, and it is very dangerous because you can't go back. There's no way you can. And there's people who spend years in this stage, who are living in the past, who are trying to bargain their way with God to somehow make it right, when it will never be right and it'll never be the same. So every time those what ifs start to come up, I allow myself to go there, but I don't allow myself to stay there. I need to eventually tell myself there's no point in thinking that way, and it doesn't get me anywhere. I think especially when someone takes their own life, everyone around them feels this sense of guilt of what could I have done differently. They deal with this stage of bargaining because there is so many what ifs with that situation. But it helps to know that I'm not the only one who feels that way. Everyone else who loved him has also had that thought, oh, I could have saved them had I only just... But the reality is he made the decision that he made, and it wasn't any of our faults. The next stage we're going to talk about is anger. As I said, you can kind of get stuck in these phases, and I was stuck in anger for a long time. Again, I feel like especially when someone takes their own life, there's a lot of room for anger there. How could he do this to everyone? Because he wasn't thinking about everyone else. He was just thinking of ending his own pain. It was especially hard to forgive him, knowing that he knew who would find him. He knew it would be me to deal with the aftermath. He knew he was leaving me to raise 2 kids by myself. And for a really long time, for months, I was so angry with him, and I felt nothing but that anger. And it didn't leave any room for moving forward or for dealing with any other aspects of my grief. All the love that I had for him, it felt like my anger had just eaten it up. And I distinctly remember the exact moment I moved out of this phase. I was in a treatment center, and I was working on a letter to him. It was the last assignment I had until I went home, and I started the letter off very angry. I let it all out. I told him how mad I was. How could you do this to me? You're a coward, you're so selfish. And I let all those feelings out, and then I came into this place of an understanding for him, and that was not his intention at all. It wasn't about me. And ever since I cleared that anger, I've finally been able to move forward and start to honor him again. But anger is a very real stage of grief, and I feel like there's a lot of shame around it. But it is okay to feel that anger, whether that's at yourself, whether that's at that person, whether it's at the systems that led to their death. The next stage is depression. When I lost Landon, this was something that I was very familiar with, not a stranger to me, but it still was just really hard, as it always has been. It's just this sense of hopelessness. How can I go on without them? There's no point, you know? And it leads to just this lack of motivation to do anything with your life. I spent days laying in bed. Thank God I have so much support, and my kids were taken care of while I took that time to just be depressed. And I just laid in bed and I just cried. But because I have the girls, I still had hope. I still had something to fight for. There was a very real reason for me to carry on. And if it weren't for them, I probably would have stayed in that depression a lot longer. And I still obviously get very sad about it, but not to the point where I allow myself to sink into depression. Because I have experienced that there is a life to live, even without him in it. But he'd want me to carry on. He wouldn't want me to spend the rest of my life laying in bed. And the final stage is acceptance. There comes a certain point where, in those gaps between the waves, you go from being in denial about it to being in acceptance about it as your resting state. And that doesn't mean by any means that you're over it. Those waves are still gonna come. They may be a little bit more spaced out, but you eventually return to that state of acceptance. And it's a light at the end of the tunnel that is grief. I feel like a lot of people see acceptance as a really positive thing, but to me, it's just very neutral. This is what it is, and there is nothing I can do about it. And you just have to remind yourself that they're in a better place, or whatever you can tell yourself to make you feel a little bit better. I remind myself that he's not hurting anymore. And learning to accept the one thing I thought I could never accept has really changed my life for the better in so many ways. I've learned so much about acceptance through grief. In life, I have to remind myself often, there is nothing you can do but accept this. All suffering is just the lack of acceptance. Radically accepting absolutely everything for exactly what it is. Nothing more, nothing less. Has just changed the way I perceive everything. And it's hard to do, and it took losing Landon to learn how to accept things. Those are the 5 well-known stages of grief that are often talked about, but I wanted to add a 6th stage that is always present, always there, and I call it pure grief. And it's just missing them. It's just wishing they were here, wishing they could see what you see, wishing you could hear their voice again. And it's taken me a long time to move into that space where my grief isn't diluted by all those other stages. It's pure. It's just missing him. And it's really sad, obviously, but there's a sense of peace to it, to not having all these other complicated feelings in the way. Those still come up sometimes, but more and more when I'm hit with a wave of grief, it's just this pure grief. And this grief is a lot easier to carry. It feels good to let out. It feels good to reminisce. Because after over a year of all these other things festering and building up, I feel like that pure grief was kind of buried beneath them. And it made me feel really disconnected from him. But to miss him in such a pure way, it makes me feel close to him again. Grief is really hard, but there's so much you learn from that journey. And it helps you to deal with life. I'm so much more equipped now to handle all of it, to handle parenthood, to handle dealing with my own mental health problems. It truly has made me stronger. I hope this video was helpful. If you're grieving someone, I see you, and I know how much it hurts. And it's hard because no one knows exactly how you felt about that person and your specific relationship with them. So how could they possibly know the hurt? And I get that, but the love you felt for them is still so powerful and still so prevalent. You just feel it in a different way now, but it's just as special. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, Camille.